The autumn wind carried the acrid smell of charred wood across the Colorado plains as Catherine Whitmore stepped down from the dusty stagecoach, her silk gloves clutching a worn leather satchel that contained more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. She had traveled 800 miles from Boston to marry a man she'd never met, carrying secrets that could either save a dying frontier town or destroy everything she'd ever hoped to build. But the homestead she'd expected to find was nothing but blackened timber and ash. And the man waiting for her wasn't the prosperous rancher from the letters. He was a one-armed blacksmith named Samuel Hayes, standing amid the ruins with eyes that held more pain than any human being should carry. What Catherine didn't know was that her arrival would trigger a chain of events that would challenge everything the small town of Cedar Ridge believed about justice, redemption, and the true meaning of wealth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October sun hung low over the Colorado Territory as the Denver and Rio Grande stagecoach rattled along the rutted dirt road towards Cedar Ridge. Catherine Elizabeth Whitmore pressed her face to the small window, watching the endless expanse of golden prairie grass bend in waves beneath the autumn wind. At 26, she possessed the kind of refined beauty that turned heads in Boston drawing rooms. Auburn hair arranged in perfect ringlets, green eyes that sparkled with intelligence, and the bearing of someone born to privilege. But beneath her carefully maintained exterior lay desperation that had driven her halfway across a continent to marry a complete stranger. The leather satchel at her feet contained $47,000 in banknotes and gold certificates, her late father's entire hidden fortune, discovered only after his funeral 6 months earlier. Harrison Whitmore had been a respected Boston banker, at least publicly. What Catherine had learned from his private papers was that he'd been quietly funneling money from corrupt railroad deals into secret accounts, planning to disappear west. Before his partners realized how much he'd skimmed from their ventures, his sudden death from a heart attack had left Catherine with a choice: expose her father's crimes and face the social destruction that would follow, or disappear herself before his partners came looking for their missing money. The mail-order bride advertisements in the Boston Herald had seemed like divine providence, a chance to start over in a place where Harrison Whitmore's reputation couldn't follow her. Thomas Brennan's letters had painted Cedar Ridge as a thriving cattle town with endless opportunities for investment and growth. He described himself as a successful rancher with 2,000 head of cattle and plans to expand into mining and railroad development. His photograph showed a handsome man in his 30s with kind eyes and a confident smile. Most importantly, he'd mentioned needing a business partner as much as a wife, someone with education and capital to help build something lasting. Catherine had responded cautiously at first, then with growing enthusiasm, as Thomas's letters revealed. An intelligent, ambitious man who shared her dreams of building something meaningful on the frontier. When he'd proposed marriage and suggested she bring investment capital to help expand his operations, it had seemed like the perfect solution to her impossible situation. Now, as the stagecoach crested a small hill and Cedar Ridge came into view, Catherine felt her stomach tighten with nervous anticipation. The town was smaller than she'd expected, maybe 30 buildings scattered along a single main street, with a few hundred souls at most. But it looked prosperous enough, with a solid-looking bank, a well-maintained general store, and several businesses that suggested economic activity. The stagecoach pulled up in front of Murphy's Hotel, a 2-story wooden building that dominated the center of town. As Catherine gathered her belongings, she noticed several townspeople stopping their activities to stare at the new arrival. Word traveled fast in small towns, and clearly her impending marriage to Thomas Brennan was public knowledge. "End of the line, miss," called the driver. a weathered man named Jake Morrison, who'd maintained a respectful distance during the 3-day journey from Denver. Cedar Ridge, Colorado Territory. Catherine accepted his assistance, stepping down from the coach, her fashionable traveling dress drawing even more attention from the gathering crowd. She wore deep blue wool with intricate embroidered details, clearly expensive and completely impractical for frontier life, but she'd wanted to make a good impression on her future husband. "Mrs. Whitmore?" A woman's voice called from the hotel porch. Catherine turned to see a tall, angular woman in her 50s, approaching with a concerned expression. She wore a simple brown dress and had the calloused hands of someone accustomed to hard work. "I'm Martha Murphy. I run the hotel here. I need to speak with you privately." Something in Martha's tone made Catherine's chest tighten with foreboding. "Is something wrong? I'm here to meet Thomas Brennan. We're to be married tomorrow." Martha's face creased with sympathy. "Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps we should go inside. There's been developments since you left Boston." Catherine allowed herself to be led into the hotel's modest lobby, her mind racing with possibilities. Had Thomas changed his mind? Had he discovered something about her father's business dealings? The satchel containing her fortune suddenly felt impossibly heavy. "Mrs. Whitmore," Martha began gently, "Thomas Brennan died 3 weeks ago. There was a fire at his ranch. A terrible accident with a kerosene lamp. The whole homestead burned to the ground. Tom tried to save his cattle, but—" She shook her head sadly. "He didn't make it out." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She sank into a wooden chair, her carefully maintained composure cracking. "Dead. But his last letter was dated only a month ago. He was planning our wedding, talking about the future." "Tom was a good man," Martha continued. "The whole town mourned his passing. He'd been looking forward to your arrival for months, telling everyone about his educated bride from Boston who was going to help him expand his operations." Catherine stared at the floor, trying to process this devastating news. She was stranded in a frontier town with no connections, no home to return to, and a fortune that belonged to criminals who would eventually come looking for it. What happened to his property, his cattle? "That's where things get complicated," Martha said, glancing toward the hotel's front window. "Tom had debts, more debts than anyone realized. When he died, his creditors moved fast. The bank foreclosed on what was left of the land, and the cattle were sold to pay off his obligations. There wasn't much left after the fire anyway." Through the window, Catherine could see a man approaching the hotel. He was tall and broad-shouldered, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the deep lines of exhaustion and grief etched around his eyes. What struck her most was his left arm, or rather, the absence of it. His left sleeve was pinned up at the shoulder, and he moved with the careful balance of someone who'd learned to compensate for missing weight on one side of his body. "That's Samuel Hayes," Martha said, following Catherine's gaze. "He was Tom's closest friend. Sam's been trying to salvage what he could from the burned homestead, looking for anything that might have survived the fire." Samuel Hayes pushed through the hotel's front door, bringing the smell of wood smoke and honest work with him. His remaining hand held a blackened piece of metal that might once have been a picture frame. When he saw Catherine, he stopped short, his dark eyes taking in her expensive dress and obvious distress. "You must be Catherine Whitmore," he said quietly. His voice carried a slight Irish accent, softened by years in America. "Tom talked about you constantly. I'm Samuel Hayes. I was Tom's business partner." Catherine stood, trying to maintain some dignity despite her circumstances. "Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Murphy has just informed me about Thomas's death. I'm still trying to understand what this means." Samuel studied her face, clearly recognizing the shock and fear she was trying to hide. "It means you've traveled a long way for nothing, I'm afraid." Tom's dreams died with him in that fire. Sam, Martha interjected with a warning tone. She's had enough bad news for one day, but Catherine needed to understand her situation completely. Mr. Hayes, you mentioned being Thomas's business partner. What exactly did that partnership involve? Samuel's expression darkened. Tom had big plans, too big, as it turned out. He'd been borrowing money from every bank and investor between Denver and Colorado Springs, convinced that cattle prices were going to triple when the railroad reached Cedar Ridge. He put everything he had into expanding his herd, plus everything he could borrow. And when the railroad was delayed, Catherine asked, though she already suspected the answer. Cattle prices collapsed. Tom couldn't service his debts, let alone repay them. The fire just made everything final. Samuel set the blackened picture frame on Martha's desk. I've been going through the ruins, trying to find anything of value for his creditors. So far, I've found maybe $50 worth of salvageable metal. Catherine felt the weight of irony settling on her shoulders. She'd come west carrying a fortune, seeking a partnership with a man who died broke trying to build the same kind of empire her father had constructed through corruption. What about you, Mr. Hayes? Are you financially responsible for Thomas's debts? Legally, no, Tom was careful about that. But morally? Samuel shrugged his shoulder. I encouraged his expansion plans. I thought the railroad money was guaranteed. I was wrong. Martha poured 3 cups of coffee from a pot on her stove, clearly recognizing that this conversation was going to take some time. Sam, what Catherine needs to know is what her options are. She can't very well return to Boston after coming all this way. Samuel accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hand around the warm cup. Mrs. Whitmore, what resources do you have? Tom mentioned you were bringing investment capital to help with his operations. Catherine's mind raced. These people seemed honest and trustworthy, but she couldn't reveal the true source or extent of her wealth. I have some savings, enough to establish myself, perhaps start a small business. There's always room for educated folks in Cedar Ridge, Martha said encouragingly. We could use a school teacher, or maybe someone to help Doc Peterson with his medical practice. You clearly have breeding and education. But Samuel was studying Catherine with more penetrating attention. Mrs. Whitmore, forgive me for being direct, but that dress you're wearing cost more than most folks here make in a year. Your gloves are Paris leather, your jewelry is genuine. Some savings seems like an understatement. Catherine felt heat rising in her cheeks. She'd underestimated how observant a frontier businessman might be. My father left me comfortable. I thought Thomas and I might build something together. Build what? Samuel asked. Tom's land is gone. His cattle are sold. His reputation died with him when the extent of his debts became known. What exactly were you planning to build? The directness of his question sparked something in Catherine, not anger, but a recognition of honesty that she had rarely encountered in Boston's polite society. I was planning to build a future, Mr. Hayes, a place where I could be more than just someone's ornamental wife, where I could use my mind and my resources to create something lasting. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. And now? Now I'm a woman alone in a town where I know no one, where the man I came to marry is dead, and where apparently everyone thinks I'm too wealthy for my own good. Catherine met his gaze steadily. What would you do in my situation, Mr. Hayes? I'd be honest about what I had and what I wanted, Samuel replied. Because in a town this size, secrets don't stay secret long. People are going to wonder about a woman who can afford to travel first class from Boston, but claims to have only some savings. Martha nodded approvingly. Sam's right. Cedar Ridge isn't Boston. We look out for each other here, but we don't tolerate folks who aren't straight with us. Catherine felt a moment of decision approaching, the kind of moment that would determine the course of her entire future. She could continue lying, maintain her secrets, and remain forever an outsider. Or she could trust these strangers with at least part of the truth and risk everything on their integrity. "You're right," she said finally. "I have more than savings, substantially more. My father was successful in his business dealings. When he died, he left me with resources that could rebuild what Thomas lost, if applied correctly." Samuel leaned forward slightly. "How much more?" Catherine took a deep breath. "Enough to buy Tom's land back from the bank, enough to restock his cattle operation, enough to invest in the railroad development that he was counting on." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of Martha's mantel clock. Both Samuel and Martha were staring at Catherine with new understanding and new wariness. "Mrs. Whitmore," Samuel said carefully, "that kind of money doesn't travel in a lady's satchel. That kind of money has banks and lawyers and legal complications." "Usually," Catherine agreed, "but unusual circumstances sometimes create unusual opportunities." She could see Samuel's mind working, calculating possibilities and risks. Finally, he asked the question she'd been dreading. "What kind of unusual circumstances?" Catherine met his gaze steadily, knowing that her answer would determine whether Cedar Ridge became her salvation or her destruction. The weight of her father's stolen fortune pressed against her conscience, but the weight of her own desperate need for redemption pressed even harder. "The kind that requires someone to disappear completely from their old life," she said quietly, "and someone else to help them build something entirely new." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Samuel Hayes set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his single hand steady despite the weight of Catherine's revelation. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge's main street and the normal sounds of frontier life. Horses, wagon wheels, distant hammering from his forge, seemed muted by the tension in Martha's hotel lobby. "Mrs. Whitmore," Samuel said finally, "in my experience, when someone needs to disappear completely from their old life, it's usually because their old life involved activities that interested federal marshals." Catherine felt her breath catch. Samuel Hayes was more perceptive than she'd anticipated, and considerably more direct than the polite society gentleman she was accustomed to. "That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Hayes." "It's not an accusation. It's an observation." Samuel stood and walked to the window, studying the street with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to notice details. "You traveled first class from Boston, which means you had reservations made weeks in advance. Your luggage is expensive. Leather, custom-made. Your jewelry is real, not paste. But you're carrying your wealth in cash rather than bank drafts or letters of credit." Martha refilled their coffee cups, her movements betraying nervous energy. "Sam, maybe we shouldn't—" "No, Martha. If Mrs. Whitmore is going to be part of this community, we need to understand what we're dealing with." Samuel turned back to Catherine. "Cash is what people carry when they can't afford to have banks asking questions about where the money came from." Catherine stood as well, meeting his gaze directly. She'd underestimated this one-armed blacksmith, assumed that his physical disability and frontier location meant limited intelligence. That had been a mistake. "You're suggesting I'm a criminal, Mr. Hayes?" "I'm suggesting you're someone with access to a lot of money who needs to disappear from Boston society. In my experience, that combination usually means either crime or scandal. Since you don't strike me as the type to rob banks, I'm guessing scandal." The accuracy of his assessment was both impressive and terrifying. Catherine realized she was dealing with someone who'd learned to read people with the same precision he probably brought to working metal in his forge. "And what if you're right? What would that mean for your assessment of my proposition?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing risks and possibilities. When he spoke, his voice carried a new quality, calculation mixed with something that might have been hope. It would mean you're desperate enough to make a real partnership work. People with easy options don't travel 1,800 miles to marry strangers. Martha looked between them with growing concern. Sam, you're not seriously considering— Martha, look around. Samuel gestured toward the window. Half the businesses on Main Street are barely hanging on. The railroad was supposed to arrive 2 years ago. Instead, they rerouted through Grand Junction, and we're dying slowly. Tom's failure wasn't just his personal tragedy. It was a symptom of Cedar Ridge's larger problem. Catherine felt a spark of recognition. This was the kind of conversation she'd hoped to have with Thomas Brennan, strategic thinking about economic development rather than polite social pleasantries. What kind of larger problem? We're too small to attract serious investment, too isolated to benefit from the railroad boom, and too dependent on cattle prices that fluctuate based on decisions made in Chicago and New York. Samuel returned to his chair, leaning forward with growing intensity. Tom understood that. His mistake was trying to solve it by borrowing money he couldn't repay instead of finding real capital partners. Real capital partners, Catherine repeated. Like someone with resources who needed to establish herself in a community that didn't ask too many questions about her background? Exactly like that. Samuel's expression had shifted from wariness to frank evaluation. Mrs. Whitmore, how much money are we actually talking about? Catherine glanced at Martha, who was listening with obvious fascination despite her concerns. In Boston, discussing specific financial figures would have been considered vulgar. But frontier business apparently operated by different rules. Enough to buy back Thomas's land, restock his cattle operation, and invest in 3 or 4 additional business ventures. Be specific, $47,000. The silence that followed was profound. Martha's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with shaking hands. Samuel stared at Catherine as if she'd just announced she was from Mars. Sweet Jesus, Martha whispered. Catherine, that's more money than this entire town sees in 5 years. Samuel was doing calculations in his head, his expression cycling. Through disbelief, possibility, and growing excitement, 47,000, that could buy Tom's land, rebuild the homestead, purchase breeding stock, establish a proper sawmill, maybe even convince the railroad to reconsider their routing decisions. Or, Catherine said quietly, it could disappear very quickly if invested unwisely by people who don't understand business principles. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly. Mrs. Whitmore, I may be a one-armed blacksmith in a dying frontier town, but I'm not stupid. I helped Tom plan his expansion, did his books, negotiated his contracts. His failure wasn't due to lack of business understanding. It was due to lack of capital and over-reliance on borrowed money. Catherine felt heat rising in her cheeks. She'd been condescending without meaning to, falling back on Boston prejudices. About frontier intelligence. Mr. Hayes, I apologize. That was unnecessarily insulting. Apology accepted. But it illustrates our fundamental problem. Samuel stood again, beginning to pace in the small space. A habit, Catherine realized, that probably helped him think. You have money and education, but you don't understand frontier economics. I understand the local market and have business experience, but I don't have capital. We need each other, but we don't trust each other. Trust has to be earned, Catherine replied, and it works both ways. How do I know you won't take my money and disappear? How do I know you're actually competent to manage large-scale investments? Martha had been following their exchange with growing amazement. Are you two seriously discussing a business partnership? Catherine, you've been in Cedar Ridge for less than 2 hours. Mrs. Murphy is right, Samuel said. This is moving very fast. But Mrs. Whitmore, you said yourself that you need to disappear from your old life. That suggests urgency. How much time do we have before whatever you're running from catches up with you? The question struck at Catherine's deepest fear. Her father's business partners would eventually discover the missing money and begin tracing its movement. Bank records would show large cash withdrawals in Boston, and determined investigators could follow the trail west. Months, perhaps. Maybe. Longer if I'm careful about how I surface the money. Surface it, convert it into legitimate investments that can't be traced back to its original source. Catherine was revealing more than she'd intended, but Samuel's directness was drawing honesty from her. Money has to be laundered through legitimate business activities to become truly safe. Samuel stopped pacing and stared at her. Mrs. Whitmore, you're talking about money laundering. That's not just scandal, that's federal crime. Catherine felt the conversation reaching a critical juncture. She could retreat into vague explanations and polite deflection, or she could trust these frontier strangers with the truth that could either save her or destroy her. My father was involved in business activities that weren't entirely legal. When he died, he left me with resources that technically belonged to other people. I can either return that money and face the consequences of his actions, or I can use it to build something legitimate and worthwhile. What kind of consequences? Martha asked quietly. Social destruction, financial ruin, possible criminal charges as an accessory. Catherine's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. My father's business partners were powerful men who won't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatens their interests. Samuel was studying her with new intensity. And you chose to run rather than face those consequences. I chose to try to build something good from something bad. Catherine met his gaze directly. I could have returned to Boston society, played the grieving daughter, and eventually married someone appropriate, while my father's crimes were quietly covered up. Instead, I chose to take his stolen money and try to use it for legitimate purposes. Legitimate purposes? Like what? Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at Cedar Ridge's struggling main street. Like rebuilding a dying town. Like creating jobs for people who need them. Like proving that stolen money can be transformed into honest prosperity. Samuel joined her at the window. And if your father's partners find you, then I face whatever comes. Catherine's voice carried quiet determination. But at least I'll have tried to do something worthwhile with my life instead of just being another ornamental Boston socialite. Samuel was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing enormous risks against equally enormous opportunities. When he spoke, his voice carried new resolve. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to make you a proposition. But first, I need you to understand what you'd be getting into. I'm listening. Cedar Ridge isn't just struggling, it's dying. Without the railroad, we don't have sustainable economic development. Without sustainable economic development, families leave businesses close and eventually the town disappears. Samuel pointed toward various buildings on the main street. Johnson's grain store is 3 months behind on his mortgage. The Hendersons who run the dry goods shop are talking about moving to Denver. Doc Peterson is considering taking a position in Colorado Springs because he can't make a living here. Catherine absorbed this information, recognizing the economic death spiral that affected many frontier communities. What would it take to reverse that decline? Diversified economic activity. We need businesses that aren't dependent on cattle prices or railroad scheduling. We need reasons for families to stay and new families to come. Samuel's voice carried growing excitement as he warmed to the subject. A proper sawmill could supply lumber to growing communities throughout the territory. A grain mill could process crops from surrounding farms. Investment in mining claims could provide industrial activity. And with $47,000, we could do all of that. Buy Tom's foreclosed land, establish multiple business ventures, create enough economic activity to make Cedar Ridge attractive to railroad investors. Samuel turned to face her directly. Mrs. Whitmore, we could save this town. Catherine felt something stirring in her chest, an emotion she hadn't experienced since her father's death. Hope. Real, tangible hope for a future that involved more than just hiding from her past. What would such a partnership look like? Equal. Partnership in all ventures. You provide capital, I provide local knowledge and management expertise. Profits split 50-50, major decisions made jointly. Samuel's expression was serious but confident. But Mrs. Whitmore, if we do this, we do it right. No cutting corners, no shortcuts, no activities that would attract federal attention. Your money gets cleaned through legitimate business success. Martha had been listening with growing amazement. Sam, are you seriously proposing to go into business with a woman you met 2 hours ago? Martha, I'm proposing to go into business with someone who has the resources to save Cedar Ridge and the motivation to make it work. Samuel's gaze remained fixed on Catherine. The question is whether Mrs. Whitmore is willing to trust a one-armed blacksmith with her future. Catherine studied Samuel's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. What she saw was intelligence, determination, and something else: integrity. This man had evaluated her situation, understood the risks, and was offering genuine partnership rather than trying to take advantage of her desperation. Mr. Hayes, she said finally, I have one condition. What's that? We start with Tom's land. We rebuild his homestead properly, establish it as our base of operations. Catherine's voice carried new strength. I came here to marry Thomas Brennan and build a future with him. He's gone, but the dream doesn't have to die with him. Samuel extended his hand. Partners. Catherine looked at his calloused, work-hardened hand, so different from the soft, manicured hands of Boston gentlemen. This handshake would commit her stolen fortune to the dreams of a one-armed frontier blacksmith and bind her fate to a dying Colorado town. She grasped his hand firmly. Partners. The morning sun painted the Colorado plains in gold and amber as Catherine Whitmore stood at the edge of what had once been Thomas Brennan's homestead. 3 days had passed since her handshake agreement with Samuel Hayes, and now she faced the reality of what $47,000 could and couldn't accomplish. On the frontier, the devastation was more complete than she'd imagined. Where photographs had shown a sturdy 2-story farmhouse, neat outbuildings, and fenced pastures, only blackened timber skeletons remained. The barn was a twisted mass of charred beams and melted metal. Even the well had been contaminated by ash and debris, rendering it unusable. Samuel emerged from the ruins of what had been Tom's workshop, his shirt already stained with soot despite the early hour. In his remaining hand, he carried a leather-bound ledger that had somehow survived the fire, its pages singed but still readable. Tom's record books, Samuel explained, wiping ash from the cover. This one goes back 3 years. It tells us exactly what we're dealing with. Catherine accepted the ledger, careful not to let her silk gloves touch the blackened cover. Even after 3 days in Cedar Ridge, she hadn't adapted her wardrobe to frontier realities. What does it tell us? That Tom's debt situation was worse than I thought. Samuel pointed toward various locations around the property. He owed money to the Cattlemen's Bank in Denver, the First National in Colorado Springs, and at least 4 private investors. Total obligations of nearly $18,000. Catherine felt her stomach tighten. 18,000? That's more than a third of our total capital. Gets worse. The bank foreclosed and sold the land to Gerald Morrison for $12,000, well below market value. Morrison's been waiting for an opportunity like this to expand his holdings. Samuel's expression darkened. Problem is, Morrison doesn't want to sell. He's planning to use Tom's land for grazing his own cattle. This was Catherine's first encounter. with the complex web of frontier economics and local politics that would determine whether their partnership succeeded or failed. In Boston, business disputes were resolved through lawyers and contracts. Here, apparently, personal relationships and community standing mattered more than legal documents. Who is Gerald Morrison? Biggest landowner in the county, owns about 15,000 acres between here and Grand Junction, plus the largest cattle operation in the territory. Samuel began walking toward the burned remains of the house, stepping carefully around debris. Morrison's got political connections in Denver and enough money to influence local decisions. He's also got a reputation for destroying anyone who gets in his way. Catherine followed, her fashionable boots slipping on the uneven ground. Surely he can be reasoned with. If we offer him a fair profit on his investment, Mrs. Whitmore, Gerald Morrison doesn't need money. He needs land. Tom's property controls access to the best water rights in this valley. Without it, Morrison can't expand his operation to the south. Samuel stopped at what had been the house's foundation, now just a rectangle of blackened stone. He's not going to sell to us at any price. The magnitude of their first obstacle was becoming clear. Without Tom's land, they had no base of operations, no place to establish their primary business ventures. Catherine had assumed that money could solve most frontier problems, but she was learning that some problems require different kinds of solutions. What about other available land in the area? Samuel shook his head. Morrison's been buying up everything that comes available for the past 5 years. What he doesn't own, the railroad company has claims on for potential future development. There's maybe 3 or 4 parcels left in the entire valley that aren't controlled by Morrison or the railroad. Catherine studied the burned homestead, trying to think strategically. What about those parcels? Could we build our operation on one of them? 2 problems. First, they're not as well positioned as Tom's land. No direct water access. Rougher terrain farther from town. Second, Morrison will bid against us for anything that becomes available, and he's got enough money to drive the price beyond reasonable levels. The morning breeze carried smoke from Samuel's forge in town, reminding Catherine that he'd already opened his blacksmith shop before dawn to accommodate her schedule. This man was working 18-hour days to maintain his existing business, while planning their partnership. She was beginning to understand the level of commitment required for frontier success. Mr. Hayes, it sounds like our fundamental problem isn't Tom's land specifically. It's Gerald Morrison's control of the local economy. Samuel looked at her with something like surprise. That's exactly right. Morrison has positioned himself to control or influence every major business decision in this region. Anyone who wants to succeed has to either work with him or find a way around him. And working with him isn't an option. Not for what we're planning. Samuel began walking toward the remains of Tom's barn. Morrison's business model depends on keeping this area focused on cattle ranching. Diversified economic development would threaten his control. He's opposed every attempt to bring manufacturing or processing businesses to Cedar Ridge. Catherine was beginning to see the strategic picture more clearly. Gerald Morrison wasn't just a business competitor. He was a systematic opponent of the kind of economic development that could save Cedar Ridge. Has anyone ever successfully challenged his influence? A few have tried. Jim Patterson opened a grain mill 3 years ago, planned to process crops from small farms throughout the valley. Morrison bought out Patterson's suppliers, undercutting him until he went bankrupt. Samuel's voice carried bitter experience. Sarah Jenkins tried to establish a dressmaking business, figured she could serve ranch wives and town ladies. Morrison convinced his foreman's wives to boycott her, claiming she was too uppity for Cedar Ridge. The pattern was clear: economic intimidation designed to prevent any business development that didn't serve Morrison's interests. Catherine had seen similar tactics in Boston, where powerful business interests used their influence to eliminate competition. But here, the stakes were higher because the community was smaller and more vulnerable. What happened to Patterson and Jenkins? Patterson moved to Denver, works as a mill supervisor for someone else's operation. Sarah married a rancher from Grand Junction and moved away. Samuel stopped at the barn's foundation, kneeling to examine something in the debris. Morrison's strategy is simple: make it impossible for independent businesses to succeed, and eventually everyone either works for him or leaves. Catherine knelt beside Samuel, ignoring the effect of ash and dirt on her expensive dress. "What are you looking for?" "Tom's forge. He had a small metalworking setup in the barn for maintaining his own equipment." Samuel used a piece of charred wood to move debris aside. "If the forge survived, we might be able to salvage the metalwork and use it to expand my shop in town." As they worked together, Catherine found herself thinking about Gerald Morrison's systematic control of the local economy. In Boston, such tactics would eventually attract attention from regulatory authorities or competitive business interests. But here, Morrison apparently operated without effective oversight or opposition. "Mr. Hayes, does Morrison have any vulnerabilities? Any aspect of his operation that might be challenged?" Samuel paused in his digging, clearly thinking about the question. Morrison's main weakness is that his operation is entirely dependent on cattle prices and railroad transportation. If either of those factors changed significantly, he'd be in trouble. What would it take to change those factors? Railroad development that bypassed his influence, or alternative economic activities that didn't depend on cattle markets? Samuel resumed his search through the debris. Problem is, Morrison has enough political influence to affect railroad decisions, and he's systematically prevented alternative economic development. Catherine stood and walked to the edge of the property, looking out over the valley that Morrison controlled. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing on land that had once belonged to independent ranchers like Tom. Morrison's economic stranglehold was visible across the entire landscape. "What if we didn't challenge Morrison directly?" she said, thinking aloud. "What if we found a way to work around his influence entirely?" Samuel looked up from his digging. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we established our business operations somewhere that Morrison doesn't control, but close enough to serve Cedar Ridge?" Catherine turned back toward Samuel, her mind working through possibilities. "What about land outside Morrison's? Sphere of influence but still accessible to the town? There's not much available. Morrison's been very thorough about acquiring strategic properties." Samuel stood, brushing ash from his knees. "Wait, there might be one possibility." "What?" "The old mining claims up in Copper Canyon. About 10 miles north of town, rough terrain, but there's water and timber. The claims were abandoned when the veins played out, but the land rights might still be available." Catherine felt a spark of excitement. What would it take to acquire those rights? Research at the county courthouse, probably a trip to Denver to check federal mining records. But Mrs. Whitmore, that's mountain country. Building anything substantial up there would be expensive and difficult. More expensive than paying Gerald Morrison's inflated prices for land he doesn't want to sell. Samuel was quiet for a moment, clearly evaluating the possibility. "You're talking about establishing a base of operations 10 miles from town, in terrain that's challenging even for experienced frontiersmen. Are you prepared for that kind of hardship?" Catherine looked down at her silk dress and impractical boots, then at the calloused hands and work-hardened physique of her business partner. "Mr. Hayes, 3 days ago I was a Boston socialite planning a comfortable marriage to a prosperous rancher. Today I'm discussing mining claims and mountain construction projects. I think I'm prepared for more hardship than either of us realizes." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses reached them across the prairie. Catherine turned to see 3 riders approaching the burned homestead. One man in expensive clothes, mounted on a magnificent black stallion, flanked by 2 rough-looking companions who had the bearing of hired muscle. Gerald Morrison, Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying new tension, and he's brought company. Catherine felt her heart rate increase as she realized their first real test was approaching. Morrison had clearly learned about their presence at Tom's land and decided to assert his authority. The next few minutes would determine whether their partnership could survive its first direct confrontation with the local power structure. "Mr. Hayes," she said, straightening her shoulders and adopting the bearing she'd learned in Boston drawing. "Rooms. I think it's time we met Mr. Morrison formally." Samuel moved to stand beside her, his missing arm somehow making his presence seem more rather than less formidable. "Mrs. Whitmore, be careful what you say. Morrison's got the sheriff in his pocket and enough influence to cause us serious problems if we handle this wrong." The riders were close enough now that Catherine could see Morrison's face, handsome in a brutal way, with cold eyes that evaluated everything in terms of potential threat or advantage. This was the man who had systematically destroyed Tom's dreams and controlled Cedar Ridge's economic future. As Morrison reined his horse to a stop 20 feet away, Catherine realized that everything about their partnership would be tested in the next few minutes. Their ability to work together, their courage under pressure, and their commitment to the dreams they'd shaken hands on 3 days earlier. "Mr. Hayes," Morrison called out, his voice carrying casual authority. "I hear you've been showing Tom's property to potential buyers. I thought I made it clear that this land isn't for sale." Samuel stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Catherine and Morrison's men. "Mr. Morrison, this is Mrs. Catherine Whitmore. She was engaged to marry Tom before he died." Morrison's gaze shifted to Catherine, evaluating her with the same cold calculation he probably used to assess cattle or land prices. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry for your loss. Tom was a good man who made some unfortunate business decisions." Catherine felt the weight of Morrison's attention and realized that her response would set the tone for everything that followed. She could be intimidated, diplomatic, or defiant. The choice would determine not just this conversation, but the future of their partnership and Cedar Ridge itself. Catherine Whitmore drew herself up to her full height, channeling every lesson in deportment and social authority her Boston finishing school had provided. Gerald Morrison might control the Colorado Territory's cattle industry, but he had never faced a woman trained to navigate the treacherous social waters of New England high society. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the kind of polite steel that could cut glass, "how thoughtful of you to ride out personally to express your condolences. I'm sure Thomas would have appreciated your concern for his welfare while he was still alive to benefit from it." The subtle barb hit its mark. Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing that this fashionably dressed Eastern woman wasn't going to be intimidated by his usual tactics. His two companions shifted in their saddles, hands moving instinctively closer to their sidearms. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think there may be some misunderstanding about your situation here." Morrison's tone remained cordial, but Catherine caught the underlying threat. "Tom's property has been legally foreclosed and sold. There's nothing here for potential buyers to purchase." Samuel stepped forward, his single hand hanging loose at his side, but his posture radiating controlled tension. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Whitmore isn't here as a buyer. She's here as Tom's intended widow, paying her respects to his memory." "Of course." Morrison's smile was cold and calculating. "Though I understand she's been asking questions about property, values and business opportunities in Cedar Ridge. That suggests interests beyond paying respects." Catherine realized that Morrison had sources of information throughout the small town, probably including Martha Murphy's hotel. Any conversation, any inquiry, any business discussion was being reported back to him within hours. The level of surveillance and control was more sophisticated than she'd expected from a frontier cattle baron. Mr. Morrison, I'm curious about something, Catherine said, adopting the conversational tone she'd used in Boston drawing rooms to deliver devastating social cuts. How does a man become so concerned with controlling every aspect of a community's economic development? It must require tremendous dedication to monitor every visitor, every conversation, every potential business opportunity. Morrison's facade of politeness slipped slightly. Mrs. Whitmore, I protect my investments and my community's interests. Cedar Ridge has prospered under stable leadership and traditional economic activities. Prospered? Catherine gestured toward the burned homestead. Mr. Morrison, from what I've observed, Cedar Ridge is dying. Half the businesses on Main Street are struggling, families are leaving, and the town has been passed over for railroad development. If this is prosperity, I'd hate to see what decline looks like. One of Morrison's companions, a hard-faced man with a prominent scar across his left cheek, leaned forward in his saddle. Lady, you might want to watch your tone. Mr. Morrison's done more for this territory than Jake. Morrison's single word carried enough authority to silence his man immediately. But Catherine had learned something valuable from the exchange. Morrison's control was maintained through a combination of economic pressure and physical intimidation. Samuel had caught the same implication. Mr. Morrison, are you threatening Mrs. Whitmore? I'm offering friendly advice. Morrison's tone remained superficially cordial. The frontier can be dangerous for people who don't understand local customs and established relationships. Newcomers sometimes make unfortunate mistakes. Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning breeze. Morrison was being very careful to avoid explicit threats, but his meaning was clear. She was beginning to understand why Tom's other potential competitors had left Cedar Ridge or been driven out of business. Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice carrying new resolve, I appreciate your concern for my welfare. Perhaps you could clarify something for me. What specific local customs should I be aware of? What established relationships are most important to understand? Morrison studied her face, clearly trying to determine whether she was being genuinely naive or subtly defiant. Mrs. Whitmore, Cedar Ridge thrives because we work together toward common goals. Business ventures that serve the community's established interests are welcomed and supported. Activities that work against those interests tend to encounter difficulties. And who determines what serves the community's established interests? The question hung in the air like a gunpowder charge, waiting for a spark. Samuel tensed beside Catherine, recognizing that she was pushing Morrison toward an explicit admission of his control over the town's economic life. Morrison's smile became genuinely predatory. Mrs. Whitmore, the community's leaders naturally have more experience and better information for making such determinations. People who've invested their lives and fortunes in Cedar Ridge's development. People like yourself, among others. Morrison's tone suggested the conversation was approaching its conclusion. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sure you have many decisions to make about your future plans. I hope you'll consider carefully before committing to any particular course of action. Catherine recognized the dismissal and the veiled threat contained within it. Morrison expected her to retreat, to accept his authority and either conform to his wishes or leave Cedar Ridge entirely. Instead, she decided to test the limits of his control. Mr. Morrison, I'm actually very interested in your success here. Building a cattle operation of your scope must have required overcoming significant obstacles. Catherine's tone was conversational, almost admiring. I'm curious about your expansion strategies. How does someone acquire so much land in such a competitive market? The question was designed to probe Morrison's methods while maintaining a facade of innocent curiosity. Samuel shot her a warning glance, recognizing that she was walking dangerous Ground, Morrison's expression shifted from cordial threat to genuine wariness. Mrs. Whitmore, successful business requires understanding market opportunities and acting decisively when those opportunities arise. Of course, and I imagine it helps to have good relationships with banks and local officials. Catherine's smile was sweetly innocent. Tom mentioned in his letters that land acquisition in Colorado Territory can be quite complex, with federal regulations and territorial laws sometimes conflicting. Tom talked too much about things he didn't understand, Morrison said, his voice carrying new hardness. That's part of what led to his unfortunate situation. Catherine caught the shift in Morrison's tone and pressed her advantage. What kind of things didn't he understand? Morrison's scarred companion had heard enough. Boss, maybe we should... Jake, take Patterson and ride back to town. I'll catch up with you shortly. Morrison's order was delivered without taking his eyes off Catherine. Once his men had reluctantly departed, he dismounted and approached closer to where Catherine and Samuel stood. Mrs. Whitmore, Morrison said, his voice dropping to a more intimate and therefore more threatening tone. Let me be very direct with you. Tom Brennan died because he tried to compete in a market he didn't understand, using resources he didn't have, challenging established interests that had been years in the making. Samuel moved slightly closer to Catherine, his body language protective. Morrison, that sounds remarkably like a threat. It's a statement of economic reality. Morrison's gaze remained fixed on Catherine. This territory has room for people who understand their place in the established order. It has no room for people who think they can disrupt that order based on Eastern money and naive idealism. Catherine felt the full weight of Morrison's intimidation attempt, but also recognized something else, fear. Morrison was working very hard to discourage her from pursuing business activities in Cedar Ridge, which suggested that he viewed her as a genuine threat to his control. Mr. Morrison, what specifically concerns you about Eastern money and idealism? Surely investment capital would benefit the entire community. The wrong kind of investment capital, pursuing the wrong kind of business activities, can destroy established economic relationships that have taken years to develop. Morrison stepped closer, his physical presence designed to intimidate. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm trying to save you from making expensive mistakes, and if I choose to make those mistakes anyway. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how explicit he could afford to be with his threats. Then you'll discover that frontier business can be much more challenging than Eastern business. Equipment fails, suppliers become unavailable, workers find better opportunities elsewhere, sometimes buildings burn down. The reference to fires, with Tom's burned homestead visible in the background, was unmistakably deliberate. Catherine felt her anger rising, but forced herself to maintain her composed exterior. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting that Tom's fire wasn't accidental? Morrison's smile was cold and dangerous. I'm suggesting that the frontier is full of hazards for people who don't take proper precautions. Samuel had heard enough. Morrison, get off this property, now. This isn't your property, Hayes. It's mine. Morrison remounted his horse with fluid grace, clearly a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. Mrs. Whitmore, I hope you'll think carefully about our conversation. Cedar Ridge can be a wonderful place for people who understand how to fit into the community. It can be a very difficult place for people who don't. As Morrison rode away, Catherine felt her legs trembling with adrenaline and suppressed fear. The confrontation had revealed the true nature of the power structure they were challenging, and it was more dangerous than she'd anticipated. Catherine, Samuel said quietly, are you all right? He killed Tom. The words came out as a whisper, but carried absolute certainty. Morrison had Tom's homestead burned down. That wasn't an accident, it was murder. Samuel studied her face, clearly recognizing the gravity of her accusation. Catherine, that's a very serious charge. Do you have any evidence? His reference to buildings burning down, his smile when he mentioned frontier hazards, the way he talked about Tom not understanding the market. Catherine's voice grew stronger as her analysis crystallized. Samuel Morrison killed Tom to eliminate competition and acquire his land, and he just threatened to do the same to us. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, looking toward the direction Morrison had taken. If you're right, then we're not just challenging a business competitor, we're challenging a murderer who's willing to kill to protect his interests. Catherine felt the full weight of their situation settling on her shoulders. She'd come to Colorado Territory to escape her father's criminal associates, only to find herself confronting a different kind of criminal, one with more local power, and fewer legal constraints than even Boston's most corrupt businessmen. "Samuel," she said, her voice carrying new determination, "we can't let him win. Tom deserves justice, and Cedar Ridge deserves better than being controlled by a murderer." "Catherine, if Morrison killed Tom, then he won't hesitate to kill us. If we threaten his operation." Samuel's tone was grave but not defeated. "Are you prepared for that level of danger?" Catherine looked around the burned homestead, imagining Tom's final moments as flames consumed everything he'd worked to build. Then she thought about the $47,000 in her satchel, money that had been stolen in Boston but could be used to bring justice to Colorado Territory. "Samuel," she said, her voice carrying absolute resolve, "I came here to build something worthwhile with my life. If that means risking everything to stop a murderer and save a town, then that's exactly what we're going to do." As they walked back towards Cedar Ridge, Catherine realized that their partnership had just transformed from a business venture into something much more dangerous and much more important. They weren't just trying to save a dying town, they were trying to bring justice to a place where justice had been systematically suppressed by money, power, and violence. The real question was whether two people, a Boston socialite with stolen money and a one-armed blacksmith with dreams of economic development, could find a way to defeat an established criminal who controlled an entire territory's economic and political structure. The answer would determine not just their own survival, but the future of everyone in Cedar Ridge who had been living under Gerald Morrison's reign of terror. The kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows across the walls of Samuel's workshop as Catherine spread a hand-drawn map of Cedar Ridge County across his workbench. It was past midnight, and the rest of the town slept peacefully, unaware that two people were plotting to overthrow the criminal empire that controlled their lives. Samuel's forge had been cold for hours, but the workshop still radiated warmth from the day's work. Tools hung in precise order along the walls, hammers, tongs, files, and specialized metalworking implements that represented years of accumulated skill and craftsmanship. Catherine found herself studying Samuel's work environment, recognizing the same attention to detail and systematic thinking that he brought to their partnership. "The county courthouse records go back 15 years, Catherine said, pointing to locations marked on her map. "I spent 8 hours today researching every land transaction Morrison's been involved in. The pattern is unmistakable." Samuel leaned over the map, his single hand tracing the boundaries Catherine had outlined. "Show me." Morrison started with his family's original homestead, about 2,000 acres in the center of the valley. Over the past decade, he's systematically acquired every adjacent property through foreclosure, forced sale, or intimidation. Catherine's finger moved from property to property. Jim Patterson's grain mill, Sarah Jenkins's dress shop, Tom's ranch, they were all strategic acquisitions designed to eliminate competition and consolidate control. Samuel studied the pattern, his expression growing darker. "How many families?" 17. "That I can document. Some sold voluntarily and moved away. Others were foreclosed on after their businesses failed under suspicious circumstances." Catherine pulled out a ledger she'd compiled during her courthouse research. Samuel, Morrison hasn't just been acquiring land, he's been destroying lives, systematically. And the local authorities? Catherine's research had uncovered this disturbing truth as well. Sheriff Bradley owes Morrison $12,000 in personal loans. Judge Harrison bought his ranch from Morrison at well below market value. The bank president's daughter is engaged to Morrison's nephew. She looked up from her notes. Samuel, Morrison owns the entire legal system in this county. Samuel walked to his forge and began banking the coals. A nightly ritual that Catherine had learned meant he was thinking through complex problems. Catherine, if Morrison controls the sheriff, the judge, and the bank, how do we challenge him legally? We don't. Catherine's answer surprised even herself with its decisiveness. We bypass the local legal system entirely. How? Catherine had spent considerable time developing this strategy, drawing on her father's business methods while avoiding his criminal practices. Federal territorial authority supersedes local jurisdiction. Morrison's been operating as if he's beyond federal oversight, but that's only because no one's reported his activities to territorial authorities. Samuel paused in his work with the forge. You want to bring in federal marshals? I want to build a case that federal authorities can't ignore. Catherine moved to a different section of her map. Morrison's been using mail fraud to manipulate land sales, intimidating federal postal inspectors, and possibly evading territorial taxes on his transactions. Those are federal crimes. And you know this how? Catherine felt heat rising in her cheeks. My father's business activities taught me to recognize certain patterns of financial manipulation. Morrison's using techniques that would attract federal attention in Boston. He's just assuming that Colorado territory is too remote for federal oversight. Samuel finished with his forge and returned to the workbench. Catherine, involving federal authorities is dangerous. If they investigate Morrison, they might also investigate us. Your money, my money, is already committed to this partnership. If federal investigators discover its original source, I'll face those consequences. Catherine met his gaze steadily. Samuel, I came here to build something worthwhile with my life. I can't do that in a community controlled by a murderer. Samuel was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing enormous risks. What would building a federal case require? Documentation, witnesses, and evidence of interstate criminal activity. Catherine had been developing this plan throughout her courthouse research. I've already documented the pattern of land acquisitions and business failures. We need witnesses willing to testify about Morrison's intimidation tactics, and we need evidence of his federal crimes. Witnesses who are willing to risk Morrison's retaliation. Witnesses who are protected by federal authority. Catherine pulled out another set of notes. Samuel, I've identified at least 6 families who were forced out by Morrison's tactics. They're scattered across Colorado territory and neighboring states, but they're still alive, and they remember what happened to them. Samuel studied her list of potential witnesses. Jim Patterson's in Denver. The Henderson family moved to Kansas. Sarah Jenkins is in Grand Junction. He looked up at Catherine. You want to track down every family Morrison has victimized and convince them to testify against him? I want to offer them something Morrison never did: justice and compensation. Catherine's plan was ambitious, but she believed it could work. We use part of our capital to travel to these families, document their experiences, and offer them financial assistance to resettle in Cedar Ridge if they're willing to testify. That's incredibly risky. If Morrison learns what we're doing, he'll try to stop us, which will provide additional evidence of his criminal behavior. Catherine had thought through this scenario carefully. Samuel, Morrison's strength comes from operating in isolation, controlling information, and preventing his victims from organizing. If we connect his victims and give them federal protection, his power base collapses. Samuel walked to his workshop window, looking out at Cedar Ridge's sleeping Main Street. Catherine, you're proposing a campaign that could take months to execute, and will put us in direct conflict with someone who's already proven he's willing to commit murder. I'm proposing a campaign that could save this town and bring justice to everyone Morrison has victimized. Catherine joined him at the window. Samuel, what's the alternative? We establish a business in Copper Canyon, try to work around Morrison's influence and hope he doesn't burn us out like he did Tom. At least we'd be alive, would we? Morrison sees us as a threat. He made that clear this morning. He's not going to leave us alone just because we're operating 10 miles outside town. Catherine turned to face Samuel directly. We're already in danger. The question is whether we use that danger to accomplish something meaningful. Samuel was quiet for a long time, studying Catherine's face in the lamplight. When he spoke, his voice carried reluctant admiration. Catherine, when you agreed to this partnership, I thought I was getting a business associate with capital to invest. I didn't realize I was getting a criminal investigator with a personal vendetta against territorial corruption. I didn't realize it myself until this morning. Catherine's voice carried new understanding of her own motivations. Samuel, my father spent his life building wealth through criminal activities that destroyed other people's lives. I have a chance to use that stolen wealth to stop someone who's doing the same thing on the frontier. It feels like redemption. And if we fail, then we fail fighting for something worthwhile instead of running from it. Catherine moved back to the map on Samuel's workbench. Samuel, I need to know if you're committed to this plan. It's going to require risks that go far beyond normal business partnership. Samuel returned to the workbench and studied Catherine's research materials, the maps, the witness lists, the documentation of Morrison's criminal activities. Catherine, if we do this, we do it properly. No half measures, no shortcuts. We build a case that federal authorities can't ignore, and we protect every witness who helps us. Agreed, and we accept that Morrison will try to kill us long before we get federal authorities involved. Catherine felt a chill at Samuel's matter-of-fact assessment, but she didn't flinch. Then we make sure we're prepared for that possibility. Samuel extended his hand across the workbench. Partners in justice as well as business. Catherine grasped his calloused hand firmly. Partners in everything. As they shook hands over the map of Cedar Ridge County, Catherine realized that their partnership had evolved far beyond her original expectations. She'd come to Colorado territory, seeking a convenient business arrangement that would help her launder stolen money and establish a new identity. Instead, she'd found a cause worth fighting for and a partner worth trusting with her life. Samuel, she said, where do we start? We start with the one thing Morrison can't control, the truth. Samuel began rolling up Catherine's map. Tomorrow, we visit every business owner in Cedar Ridge. We document every intimidation tactic, every suspicious business failure, every family that left under mysterious circumstances. And then we take that documentation to Denver and request a meeting with territorial authorities. Samuel's expression was grimly determined. Catherine, if we're going to challenge Morrison, we need to move quickly. The longer we delay, the more time he has to organize against us. Catherine gathered her research materials, feeling both excitement and terror at the scope of what they were undertaking. Samuel, there's something else you should know. What? I sent a telegram to Boston. Today, I told my father's former business associates that I died in a stagecoach accident traveling west. Catherine met Samuel's surprised gaze. As far as the criminal world in Boston is concerned, Catherine Whitmore no longer exists. Why? Because I realize that I can't build a new life while running from my old one. If we're going to fight Morrison, I need to be completely committed to this community and this partnership." Catherine's voice carried quiet resolve. "Samuel, I've burned my bridges. Cedar Ridge is my home now, whatever happens." Samuel studied her face, recognizing the magnitude of her commitment. "Catherine, you realize there's no going back from this decision. There was no going back from the moment I decided to trust you with $47,000 in stolen money." Catherine smiled slightly. "Besides, I've discovered something about myself over the past few days." "What's that?" "I'm much braver than I thought I was, and I'm much angrier about injustice than I realized." Catherine looked toward the window, imagining Morrison's ranch in the darkness beyond Cedar Ridge. "Samuel, I want to destroy Gerald Morrison's criminal empire and save this town. I want it more than I've ever wanted anything in my life." As they prepared to leave the workshop, Catherine realized that tomorrow would mark the beginning of the most dangerous period of their lives. Morrison would recognize their activities as a direct threat to his control, and he would respond with all the violence and intimidation at his disposal. But Catherine also realized that she was no longer the frightened Boston socialite who had stepped off the stagecoach 6 days earlier. She was becoming someone new, someone who was willing to risk everything for justice and partnership and the chance to build something truly worthwhile. The question was whether that new person was strong enough to survive what was coming next. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad depot bustled with morning activity as Catherine and Samuel purchased tickets for their first investigative journey. 3 days had passed since their midnight planning session, and Catherine had spent every waking hour preparing their campaign against Morrison's criminal empire. 2 tickets to Denver, departing at 10:15, the station agent announced, sliding the tickets across his wooden counter. He was a thin man named Albert Morrison, no relation to Gerald, as he'd hastily clarified, who'd been working the Cedar Ridge depot for 8 years. Should arrive by early evening, weather permitting. Catherine accepted the tickets, noting that Albert's hands shook slightly as he processed their transaction. Word had spread quickly through Cedar Ridge that the Eastern woman and the one-armed Blacksmit were asking pointed questions about local business practices. Morrison's network of informants was already reporting their activities. "Mr. Morrison," Catherine said carefully, "you've been working here since before Tom Brennan's troubles began. You must have observed many changes in the community during that time." Albert glanced nervously toward the depot door. "Ma'am, I just sell tickets and handle freight. I don't pay much attention to local business matters." Samuel stepped closer to the counter. "Albert, we're not asking you to make accusations or take sides. We're just trying to understand what happened to good people like Tom Brennan and Jim Patterson." "Jim Patterson," Albert repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Now there was a decent man, had plans to modernize grain processing throughout the whole valley. Would have meant more freight shipments, more business for everyone. Catherine leaned forward encouragingly. "What happened to those plans?" Albert looked around the empty depot, confirming they were alone. "Started having problems with his suppliers. Farmers who'd promised to sell their grain to Jim's mill suddenly had other arrangements. Bank started calling in loans early. Equipment shipments got delayed or damaged in transit." "Did anyone investigate these problems?" Samuel asked. "Sheriff Bradley said it was just business competition. Told Jim he should work things out privately with other local businessmen." Albert's expression conveyed what he thought of the sheriff's advice. 3 months later, Jim's mill was in foreclosure, and he was packing up to leave for Denver. Catherine made mental notes of Albert's account, recognizing the same pattern she'd documented in courthouse records. "Albert, would you be willing to provide a written statement about these events to territorial authorities?" Albert's face went pale. "Ma'am, I got a wife and 3 children to support. I can't afford to lose this job or make enemies with powerful evokes. What if we could guarantee your family's safety and economic security? Catherine's offer was carefully calculated. What if we could ensure that testifying about criminal activities actually improved your situation rather than threatening it? Samuel shot Catherine a warning glance, recognizing that she was making promises they might not be able to keep. But Catherine had learned from her father's business methods that successful investigations required offering incentives as well as seeking information. How could you guarantee something like that? Albert asked skeptically. By ensuring that the criminal activities you witnessed are prosecuted by federal authorities who aren't corrupted by local influence. Catherine's voice carried quiet confidence. Albert, we're building a case that will destroy the system of intimidation that's been controlling this community. People who help us will be protected. People who continue to enable criminal activities will face consequences. The train whistle sounded in the distance, signaling the approach of their Denver-bound locomotive. Albert processed this information quickly, clearly recognizing an opportunity that might not come again. Mrs. Whitmore, if you can really bring federal authorities into this situation, there's something else you should know about. Albert glanced once more toward the door. The mail fraud. Catherine felt her pulse quicken. Mail fraud was a federal offense that would provide exactly the kind of jurisdiction they needed. What kind of mail fraud? Morrison's been intercepting mail addressed to potential business competitors. Letters from suppliers, correspondence with investors, even personal mail from family members back east. Albert's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. He's got an arrangement with someone at the postal sorting facility in Grand Junction. Mail gets delayed, redirected, or sometimes just disappears entirely. Samuel leaned across the counter. Albert, how do you know this? Because I've been documenting missing shipments and delayed correspondence for 2 years. Part of my job is tracking freight and mail delivery problems. Albert pulled out a leather-bound logbook from beneath his counter. This book contains records of every suspicious mail incident I've observed. Catherine stared at the logbook, recognizing its potential. Value as evidence. Albert, would you allow us to copy those records? Ma'am, if you can really bring federal postal inspectors into this situation, you can have the original logbook. I've got copies hidden at my house. Albert's decision seemed to surprise even himself. Mrs. Whitmore, my family's been living in fear for 2 years, watching good people get destroyed by Morrison's tactics. If there's a real chance to stop him, I want to help. The train pulled into the depot with a screech of brakes and a cloud of steam. Catherine and Samuel had minutes to complete their transaction with Albert before departure. Albert, we'll be in Denver for 3 days, meeting with territorial authorities and locating witnesses. When we return, we'll contact you about providing formal testimony. Catherine accepted Albert's logbook, feeling the weight of evidence that could destroy Morrison's mail fraud operation. Can you recommend anyone else in Cedar Ridge who might be willing to cooperate with federal investigators? Albert considered the question carefully. Doc Peterson has been keeping records of suspicious injuries and deaths. Martha Murphy at the hotel has documentation of threatening conversations she's overheard. Bill Johnson at the grain store has been tracking suspicious supply disruptions. Catherine realized that Morrison's victims had been quietly documenting his crimes for years, waiting for someone with the resources and courage to organize their testimonies into a coherent legal case. Albert spread the word carefully to those people. Tell them that federal authorities will be interested in their documentation. As they boarded the train, Samuel expressed concern about Catherine's promises to Albert. Catherine, you're making commitments about federal protection and prosecution that we might not be able to deliver. Samuel, we have to give people hope that their cooperation will be worthwhile. Catherine settled into their train compartment, Albert's logbook secure in her traveling bag. Besides, we're not making empty promises. We have the resources and determination to see this through. The train departed Cedar Ridge, carrying them toward Denver and their first crucial meeting with territorial authorities. Catherine spent the journey reviewing her investigation materials, property records, witness lists, financial documentation, and now Albert's evidence of mail fraud. "Samuel," she said as Colorado planes rolled past their window, "look at what we've accomplished in just 1 week. We've documented Morrison's pattern of criminal activity, identified multiple witnesses, and uncovered federal crimes that provide jurisdiction for prosecution." Samuel was reading Albert's mail delivery logbook, his expression growing darker with each page. "Catherine, this is worse than we realized. Morrison hasn't just been intimidating local competitors. He's been systematically sabotaging any outside communication that might threaten his control, which means he's vulnerable to federal prosecution on multiple charges." Catherine felt excitement building as she recognized the strength of their developing case. Mail fraud, interstate intimidation, conspiracy to violate federal postal regulations. Any one of those charges could result in territorial intervention, assuming we can convince territorial authorities to investigate. Catherine had been preparing for this challenge throughout their planning phase. "Samuel, I've arranged to meet with 3 different territorial officials in Denver. Federal Marshal Robert Harrison, Territorial Attorney General William Chang, and Postal Inspector Margaret Walsh." Samuel looked surprised. "How did you arrange high-level meetings so quickly?" "By mentioning that I have evidence of federal crimes affecting interstate commerce and territorial development." Catherine's Boston business education was proving valuable in unexpected ways. Federal officials take such allegations seriously, especially when they involve systematic criminal activity in frontier territories. The train began its descent toward Denver, revealing the growing city spread across the Colorado landscape. Catherine felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as she prepared to present their case to federal authorities, who had the power to either support their investigation or dismiss their allegations as local business disputes. "Samuel," she said, gathering her materials as the train approached Denver's Union Station, "everything depends on the next 3 days. If we can convince federal authorities to investigate Morrison, we've won. If we can't, then we return to Cedar Ridge and face Morrison's retaliation without federal protection." Samuel's assessment was grimly accurate. "Catherine, are you ready for those stakes?" Catherine looked at Albert's logbook, thinking about all the families Morrison had destroyed through intimidation and criminal manipulation. "Samuel, I'm ready to risk everything to stop him. The question is whether federal authorities are ready to enforce their own laws in Colorado territory." As their train pulled into Denver's bustling Union Station, Catherine realized that their investigation had reached its critical juncture. The next 3 days would determine whether they could transform their documentation of Morrison's crimes into federal action that would destroy his criminal empire and save Cedar Ridge. The weight of $47,000 in stolen money, the lives of Morrison's victims, and the future of an entire frontier community now rested on their ability to convince territorial authorities that Gerald Morrison represented a federal criminal threat that demanded immediate intervention. Walking through Denver's crowded station toward their first meeting with Federal Marshal Harrison, Catherine felt the full magnitude of the responsibility she'd accepted when she shook hands with Samuel Hayes over that map of Cedar Ridge County. Justice for Tom Brennan, protection for Morrison's future victims, and redemption for her father's stolen fortune all depended on what happened in the next 72 hours. The territorial courthouse in Denver was the imposing granite structure that represented federal authority across the entire Colorado territory. Catherine Whitmore climbed its marble steps at precisely 2 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio containing evidence that could either destroy Gerald Morrison's criminal empire or result in her own prosecution for possessing stolen money. Federal. Marshal Robert Harrison's office occupied the 3rd floor, with windows overlooking Denver's rapidly expanding downtown district. Harrison himself was a tall, lean man in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades enforcing federal law across the frontier territories. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Hayes," Harrison said, gesturing for them to sit in leather chairs facing his massive oak desk. "Your telegram mentioned evidence of federal crimes affecting interstate commerce in Cedar Ridge County. That's a serious allegation." Catherine opened her portfolio, revealing Albert Morrison's mail delivery logbook, property transaction records, and witness statements she'd compiled over the past week. "Marshal Harrison, we have documented evidence of systematic mail fraud, interstate intimidation, and conspiracy to violate federal postal regulations." Harrison accepted Albert's logbook, scanning its contents with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating criminal evidence. "And this appears to document irregular mail delivery patterns over a 2-year period. What makes you believe these irregularities constitute federal crimes?" Samuel leaned forward in his chair. "Marshal, the irregularities follow a clear pattern. Mail addressed to potential business competitors of Gerald Morrison is systematically delayed, redirected, or disappears entirely. The timing corresponds exactly with Morrison's acquisition of properties belonging to those same competitors." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Hayes. What evidence supports the claim of intentional mail interference?" Catherine had prepared for this question, knowing that federal authorities would require concrete proof rather than circumstantial evidence. "Marshal Harrison, we have testimony from Depot Agent Albert Morrison documenting specific instances of mail tampering. We also have financial records showing that businesses experiencing mail problems invariably failed within months, with their properties subsequently acquired by Gerald Morrison at below-market prices." Harrison studied Catherine's documentation for several minutes, clearly evaluating both the evidence and the credibility of the people presenting it. "Mrs. Whitmore, this investigation would require significant federal resources. What's your personal interest in pursuing these allegations?" Catherine had anticipated this question, but still felt nervous about revealing her connection to Cedar Ridge. "Marshal, I was engaged to marry Thomas Brennan, who died in a suspicious fire after experiencing business difficulties that follow the same pattern documented for other Morrison victims." "You believe Morrison was responsible for Brennan's death?" "Believe Morrison has been systematically eliminating business competition through criminal activities that fall under federal jurisdiction." Catherine's voice carried quiet conviction. "Marshal Harrison, Gerald Morrison has turned Cedar Ridge County into his personal criminal empire, using federal mail systems to sabotage his competitors and local law enforcement to prevent investigation of his activities." Harrison walked to his office window, looking out over Denver's bustling streets. "Mrs. Whitmore, federal intervention in local business disputes requires clear evidence of interstate criminal activity. What you've presented suggests possible mail fraud, but proving intentional criminal conspiracy is more complex." Samuel stood and joined Harrison at the window. "Marshal, what would constitute sufficient evidence for federal investigation?" "Testimony from multiple witnesses, documentation of specific criminal acts, and evidence of interstate impact." Harrison turned back to face Catherine. "Mrs. Whitmore, how many witnesses are prepared to provide sworn testimony about Morrison's criminal activities?" Catherine felt her heart rate increase as she recognized the critical nature of Harrison's question. "We've identified 17 families who were victimized by Morrison's tactics. 6 have agreed to provide testimony if they receive federal protection. The others are afraid of retaliation. And the interstate impact? Morrison's mail fraud operation has affected correspondence and business transactions across Colorado Territory and neighboring states. Catherine pulled out a map showing the geographic scope of Morrison's activities. Marshal Harrison, his criminal enterprise extends far beyond local jurisdiction. Harrison returned to his desk and began examining Catherine's map and supporting documentation. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Hayes, I'm going to be direct with you. Federal investigation of territorial criminal activities is politically sensitive. Local officials don't appreciate federal interference in what they consider local matters. Catherine felt a chill of concern. Marshal Harrison, are you saying federal authorities won't investigate documented federal crimes because of political considerations? I'm saying federal authorities investigate carefully and thoroughly before committing resources to territorial criminal cases. Harrison's tone remained professional, but carried an undertone of warning. Mrs. Whitmore, your allegations against Gerald Morrison are serious. If they're accurate, Morrison will face significant federal charges. If they're inaccurate or exaggerated, you could face charges for filing false reports with federal authorities. Samuel stepped forward. Marshal, Harrison, what would convince you that our allegations are accurate? Harrison considered the question carefully. Additional evidence from independent sources, corroboration of your testimony from law enforcement officials outside Morrison's influence, and financial documentation proving interstate criminal conspiracy. Catherine realized that their meeting with Harrison was a test. Federal authorities were evaluating both their evidence and their commitment to pursuing the investigation despite significant risks. Marshal Harrison, we're prepared to provide all of those things. What we need is assurance that federal authorities will act on evidence of federal crimes. Mrs. Whitmore, if you provide sufficient evidence of federal criminal activity, federal authorities will investigate and prosecute accordingly. Harrison's tone carried official commitment, but I must warn you, if Morrison is as dangerous as you suggest, your investigation activities will put you in considerable personal danger. We're already in danger, Catherine replied. Morrison has made it clear that he considers us a threat to his criminal operation. Our choice is between accepting that danger while fighting for justice or accepting it while doing nothing. Harrison nodded approvingly. Mrs. Whitmore, that's exactly the kind of commitment required for successful federal criminal investigations. Their meeting was interrupted by a knock on Harrison's office door. Marshal Harrison, Postal Inspector Walsh is here for your 3 o'clock appointment. Margaret Walsh entered the office, a stern-looking woman in her 40s, wearing the dark blue uniform of the Federal Postal Inspection Service. She carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to investigating mail fraud across the frontier territories. Inspector Walsh, Harrison said, these are the people I mentioned. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore and Mr. Samuel Hayes from Cedar Ridge. They've brought evidence of systematic mail fraud in their community. Walsh studied Catherine and Samuel with penetrating attention. I've reviewed your preliminary reports, Mrs. Whitmore. Mail fraud is a serious federal offense that the Postal Service investigates aggressively. Catherine felt hopeful that Walsh's expertise would strengthen their case. Inspector Walsh, we have documentation showing that mail addressed to specific individuals has been systematically intercepted and redirected over a 2-year period. Walsh accepted Albert's logbook from Harrison, examining its contents with professional interest. This appears to be comprehensive documentation maintained by a Postal Service employee. How did you obtain these records? The depot agent in Cedar Ridge has been documenting irregular delivery patterns as part of his official duties, Samuel explained. He's willing to provide sworn testimony about his observations. Walsh continued studying the logbook, her expression growing more serious with each page. Mrs. Whitmore, If these records are accurate, they document federal crimes that could result in lengthy prison sentences for the perpetrators. Catherine felt excitement building as she recognized Walsh's professional engagement with their evidence. "Inspector Walsh, what would be required to initiate a formal Postal Service investigation?" "Sworn testimony from the postal employee corroborating evidence from affected customers and documentation of the interstate impact of the mail fraud operation." Walsh looked up from the logbook. "Mrs. Whitmore, the Postal Service has resources and authority to investigate mail fraud independently of local law enforcement cooperation." This was exactly what Catherine had hoped to hear. Federal postal inspection could bypass Morrison's corruption of local authorities entirely. "Inspector Walsh, how quickly could such an investigation begin? If your evidence supports formal charges, postal inspectors could be deployed to Cedar Ridge within 2 weeks. Walsh's tone carried official determination. "Mrs. Whitmore, mail fraud investigations are thorough and methodical. We would document every aspect of the criminal operation and build cases that result in federal prosecution." Marshal Harrison had been listening to their exchange with growing interest. "Inspector Walsh, if Postal Service investigation confirms systematic mail fraud, that would provide the federal jurisdiction needed for comprehensive criminal investigation of Morrison's entire operation." Catherine realized that their federal meetings were producing exactly the outcome they'd hoped for. Multiple federal agencies recognizing jurisdiction over Morrison's criminal activities and committing resources to investigation and prosecution. "Marshal Harrison, Inspector Walsh," Catherine said, "what do we need to do to initiate formal federal investigation?" Harrison and Walsh exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the strength of the evidence Catherine and Samuel had presented. "Mrs. Whitmore," Harrison said, "you need to return to Cedar Ridge and gather the additional testimony and documentation we've discussed. Inspector Walsh will coordinate with my office to develop a comprehensive investigation plan." "And our personal safety during this process?" "Federal witnesses in criminal investigations receive appropriate protection," Walsh assured her. "Mrs. Whitmore, once formal investigation begins, anyone who threatens or intimidates federal witnesses commits additional federal crimes." As their meeting concluded, Catherine felt a mixture of triumph and terror. They had successfully convinced federal authorities to investigate Morrison's criminal empire, but they now faced the dangerous task of gathering additional evidence while Morrison remained free to retaliate against them. "Samuel," Catherine said as they left the territorial courthouse, "we've won the first battle. Federal authorities are committed to investigating Morrison. And now comes the dangerous part," Samuel replied grimly, "gathering evidence while Morrison knows we're building a federal case against him." Catherine looked back at the imposing courthouse building, representing federal authority that could finally bring justice to Cedar Ridge County. "Samuel, we've come too far to turn back now. Morrison's criminal empire is about to face the full force of federal law enforcement." As they walked toward Denver's Union Station for their return journey to Cedar Ridge, Catherine realized that their investigation had reached its most critical and dangerous phase. Federal authorities were committed to prosecuting Morrison, but Catherine and Samuel would have to survive his retaliation long enough for that prosecution to succeed. The next few weeks would determine whether federal justice could reach into Colorado Territory's remote communities, or whether Morrison's criminal empire was too entrenched and too violent for even federal authorities to eliminate. The morning mist clung to the Colorado plains as Catherine Whitmore stood on the newly constructed porch of what had once been Thomas Brennan's burned homestead. 6 months had passed since her confrontation with Gerald Morrison, and the transformation of both the land and the community seemed almost miraculous. Behind her, the sound of construction echoed across the valley, hammers striking nails, saws cutting timber, and voices calling out measurements and instructions. The homestead that Morrison had reduced to ash and ruin now bustled with the activity of Cedar Ridge's first cooperative grain mill, its water wheel turning steadily beside the creek that Tom had once hoped to harness for irrigation. Samuel Hayes emerged from the mill's interior, his face streaked with sawdust, but wearing an expression of deep satisfaction. The past months had changed him as much as they'd changed the landscape. His missing arm no longer seemed like a disability, but simply part of who he was. A man who'd learned to build dreams with whatever tools were available. The grinding stones. Perfectly balanced," Samuel announced, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Jim Patterson says we'll be processing grain from farms across 3 counties within the month." Catherine smiled at the mention of Jim Patterson, who had returned from Denver with his family to manage the cooperative mill that Morrison's intimidation had once forced him to abandon. "And the railroad spur?" "Construction begins next week. The Denver and Rio Grande finally agreed to extend service to Cedar Ridge, now that we have guaranteed freight volume." Samuel joined Catherine on the porch, looking out over the transformed valley. "Catherine, we've accomplished everything we dreamed of that night in my workshop. Indeed, they had accomplished far more than either had imagined possible. Morrison's arrest by federal marshals had triggered an avalanche of change that swept through Cedar Ridge County like a cleansing flood. His criminal empire, built on intimidation and corruption, had collapsed the moment federal authorities began enforcing laws that Morrison had assumed would never reach Colorado territory. The mail fraud charges alone had resulted in a 20-year federal prison sentence, but those had been merely the beginning. Postal Inspector Walsh's investigation had uncovered evidence of tax evasion, interstate racketeering, and conspiracy charges that ensured Morrison would never again threaten anyone in Cedar Ridge. His ranch and business holdings had been seized by federal authorities and sold at public auction, with the proceeds used to compensate his victims. "Mrs. Hayes," called a familiar voice from the mill yard. Catherine still felt a thrill at hearing her married name, even after 4 months. Martha Murphy approached the porch, carrying a telegram and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose faith in justice had been vindicated. "A telegram from Denver," Martha announced, handing Catherine the yellow paper. "From Territorial Attorney General Chang." Catherine opened the telegram, reading its contents with growing excitement. "Samuel, the territorial legislature has approved our petition. Cedar Ridge County will receive federal funding for school, construction, road improvements, and economic development programs." The legislative approval represented the final victory in their campaign to transform Cedar Ridge from Morrison's personal criminal empire into a thriving, legitimate community. Catherine's careful documentation of Morrison's victims had provided the territorial government with a comprehensive case study in frontier corruption, leading to policy reforms that would protect other remote communities from similar criminal exploitation. Samuel studied the telegram over Catherine's shoulder. "How much funding?" $50,000 over 3 years, plus guaranteed railroad service and federal postal inspection to prevent future mail fraud. Catherine felt tears of joy and relief stinging her eyes. "Samuel, we've not only saved Cedar Ridge, we've established legal precedents that will protect frontier communities throughout the territory." Their celebration was interrupted by the approach of a familiar figure riding up the creek path. Dr. Elizabeth Peterson, formerly Sarah Jenkins, the dressmaker Morrison had driven out of business, dismounted from her horse with the confident bearing of someone who had reclaimed her place in the community that had once rejected her. Sarah had returned to Cedar Ridge 3 months earlier as the territory's first female physician, having completed medical training in Denver with financial assistance from Catherine and Samuel's development fund. Her medical practice now served the entire county, providing healthcare services that had been desperately needed during Morrison's reign of economic strangulation. "Catherine, Samuel," Sarah called out. "I have news from Grand Junction. The federal court has approved the final victim compensation payments. Every family Morrison drove out of business will receive full restitution plus damages." Catherine felt a deep sense of satisfaction at this news. The victim compensation program had been her personal project, using federal seizure of Morrison's assets to provide justice for everyone his criminal enterprise had harmed. Families scattered across Colorado Territory and neighboring states were finally receiving compensation for years of suffering under Morrison's systematic intimidation. "How many families in total?" Samuel asked. 37 families representing over 200 individuals, Sarah replied. "Some are choosing to return to Cedar Ridge. Others are using the compensation to establish themselves in new communities. But all of them are finally free from the fear and economic devastation Morrison inflicted." As Sarah departed to continue her medical rounds, Catherine reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from Boston socialite to frontier justice crusader. The $47,000 in stolen money that had once represented her father's criminal legacy had been transformed into the foundation for legitimate prosperity that would benefit generations of Cedar Ridge residents. The money had been carefully laundered through their business partnerships, land acquisitions and development projects emerging as clean capital that funded the grain mill, the expanded blacksmith operation, Sarah's medical practice, and a dozen other ventures that provided employment and economic stability for the entire community. "Catherine," Samuel said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you about the money." Catherine felt a moment of concern, wondering if federal investigators had discovered the original source of their investment capital. "What about it?" "I've known from the beginning that your father's money was stolen," Samuel said, his voice carrying gentle understanding rather than accusation. "The way you talked about needing to disappear, the amount of cash you carried, the urgency of establishing legitimate business activities, it was obvious." Catherine stared at her husband, realizing that he had accepted the full truth of her situation without ever demanding explanations or judgments. "You knew, and you still agreed to the partnership?" "Catherine, I knew that whatever your father had done, you were trying to use stolen money to build something honest and worthwhile." Samuel took her hands in his remaining hand. That seemed like exactly the kind of redemption the frontier was designed to provide. Catherine felt tears flowing freely now, overwhelmed by the depth of Samuel's acceptance and the magnitude of the transformation they had accomplished together. "Samuel, do you think we've achieved redemption? Do you think Tom would approve of what we've built on his land?" Samuel looked out over the bustling activity of the grain mill, the expanding town of Cedar Ridge visible in the distance, and the fertile valley that now supported dozens of independent farming families instead of serving as Morrison's personal cattle empire. "Catherine, Tom dreamed of building something that would benefit the entire community rather than enriching a single criminal. I think he would be proud that his death led to justice, and his land became the foundation for legitimate prosperity." As afternoon sun slanted across the Colorado plains, Catherine realized that her journey from Boston to Cedar Ridge had accomplished everything she had hoped for, and more. The stolen money had been transformed into honest wealth. The dying frontier town had become a thriving community. The criminal who had terrorized innocent families was serving a federal prison sentence that would last the rest of his life. Most importantly, Catherine had discovered that redemption was possible, that criminal legacies could be transformed into foundations for justice, that individual courage could challenge systematic oppression, and that partnerships built on trust and shared purpose could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. "Samuel," she said, "what do we do now? We've accomplished everything we set out to achieve." Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face and reminding Catherine of the determined blacksmith who had agreed to risk everything for a stranger's desperate plan. "Now we live the life we've built together. We raise our children in a community where justice matters more than power, where cooperation matters more than competition, and where people are judged by their character rather than their connections." Catherine placed her hand on her still, flat belly, thinking about the child she and Samuel would welcome in the spring. A child who would grow up in the cedar ridge they had fought to create, rather than the cedar ridge that Morrison had terrorized. And if other communities face the same kinds of criminal oppression that threaten Cedar Ridge, then we help them the same way federal authorities helped us, Samuel replied. "Catherine, we've proven that frontier justice is possible when good people are willing to fight for it. That's a responsibility as much as an achievement." As evening approached and the construction crews began securing their tools for the night, Catherine and Samuel walked through the completed sections of their grain mill. The machinery that would process crops from independent farms throughout the valley represented everything they had dreamed of. Legitimate prosperity built on cooperation rather than exploitation, economic development that benefited entire communities. Rather than enriching criminal enterprises, standing in the mill's main processing room, surrounded by the tools and equipment that would provide honest work for dozens of families, Catherine reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had begun with a simple decision to trust a one-armed blacksmith with her desperate plan for redemption. "Samuel," she said, "thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." "Catherine," Samuel replied, "thank you for proving that stolen money could build honest dreams, that Eastern education could serve frontier justice, and that a Boston socialite could become the finest partner a Colorado blacksmith could ever hope for." As they walked hand in hand toward their rebuilt homestead, where lamplight glowed warmly in windows that looked out over a valley finally free from criminal oppression, Catherine knew that she had found something more valuable than any amount of stolen money, a purpose worth fighting for, a community worth protecting, and a love built on shared commitment to justice and redemption. The mail-order bride, who had arrived in Cedar Ridge carrying desperate secrets, had become Catherine Hayes, frontier businesswoman, community leader, and partner in one of the most successful criminal justice campaigns in Colorado Territory history. And in the growing darkness of the Colorado evening, with stars beginning to appear over the plains that stretched endlessly toward distant horizons, Catherine realized that some journeys toward redemption lead exactly where they're supposed to, home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.